Let's get some analysis now. Greg Sheridan, he's the foreign editor at The Australian. Greg, it's the latest in a long and very sad series, a cycle of violence in that region between those two, or that nation Israel and the Palestinians.
Well, Kieran, I'd frame it slightly differently. As you know, I think Sky News is the greatest, most efficient, most brilliant broadcaster in the world. But I think the way you've been reporting this dispute today, all day, is very strange. The news has constantly said Hamas has fired rockets in response to Israeli bombardments. Let's get a few facts straight. Hamas initiated this conflict with attacks, rocket attacks, on Israeli civilians. Hamas is defined in Australian law as a terrorist organisation. Israel is a democratic nation and an ally of Australia. The suggestion that there's moral equivalence here, or that the two sides are equally to blame, strikes me as crackers. Similarly, the idea that Israel can just stop, that would mean that Hamas could initiate these strikes any time it liked, turn them on for a day or two, and then turn them off. So that would give it tremendous power to disrupt Israel all the time. It is Hamas which will not submit itself to an election by the people of Gaza, unlike the Israeli government, which is elected by the people of Israel. It is Hamas which has decided to fire many more than 3,000 rockets at Israeli civilians as an act of its own discretion. It is Hamas which has determined that this gesture, which it knows can have no military benefit at all, and which it knows will bring terrible tragedy on its own people, that this gesture is more important than the life and welfare of its own people. Now, honestly, what is Israel supposed to do? Just say, well, you know, fair enough, they're a terrorist organisation, they can attack us whenever they like, and we have to stop whenever we have to stop defending ourselves whenever we're told to. So Israel is being called unreasonable for saying that Hamas has to stop for 3 hours before it will abide by a ceasefire itself. What do you think Australia's reaction would be in similar circumstances?
But it goes back to that question I put at the start, Greg. I take all those points, and you know, it's hard to disagree with a lot of what you said. But the fact is, to me, it looks like the latest episode in what has just been an endless cycle of violence between those two parties. The latest spark, Sheik Jarrah in East Jerusalem. It's maybe a different catalyst to cause or prompt this attack in the first place from Hamas into Israel, but it's been a deadly cycle that's been going on, if not for centuries, certainly decades, with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, Kieran, and you know what you say is fair enough. Although I would analytically dispute this proposition. I don't think the Sheik Jarrah incident was in any sense the provocation for this. I mean, Hamas doesn't object to Israel occupying the West Bank and Gaza. And of course, Israel doesn't occupy Gaza. There was an absurd cartoon in The Age today which said, does Israel think Gaza was terra nullius? That's why they settled there. There are, as a matter of fact, no Israeli settlers in Gaza. None. Zero. None. I don't think the incident in Jerusalem was the provocation for this missiles. I think that's just accepting Hamas propaganda. Hamas has made, under Iranian influence, a clear strategic decision to try to embarrass Israel by forcing it to respond, to re-establish itself as the most violently anti-Israel group within the Palestinian leadership movement, and to follow timing which suits Iran's geo-strategic agenda. And I think that's where I think actually this sort of cycle of violence stuff can be terribly misleading. We've actually got to look at the geostrategic players and say, what are their clear purposes? Hamas is a vicious, evil, murderous terrorist organisation, but it's not irrational. It knows that it will achieve no military victory over Israel, but it has clear, rational, discernible, decipherable geostrategic aims in doing what it's doing.
When it comes to the politics, You know, speaking of being rational, it seems to me there's politics on both sides here in terms of the response. It comes at a time when Benjamin Netanyahu hasn't been able to form a government. In fact, his opposition was about to form government. And in terms of Mahmoud Abbas, he's also got his own political questions at play in all of this. Do you agree that that's motivating some of the response in relation to this violence?
I certainly agree that politics is a factor everywhere, as it is all through life. I mean, it wouldn't be, you know, the strangest irony that a Hamas attack consolidates the position of the toughest national security prime minister Israel has had in a long time. But Benjamin Netanyahu didn't choose the timing of this. I mean, there is a view throughout the Middle East that Benjamin Netanyahu is some sort of astonishingly clever Machiavellian figure who can contrive anything. You know, sort of there's a crazy view throughout the Arab world that the Mossad is behind absolutely everything. But I think it is stretching things to think that Netanyahu got Hamas to launch this attack in order to keep him in power. And any Israeli government would respond like this. Governments going back to Golda Meir, you know, in the golden era of Labour Zionist socialism, responded to attacks like this. There is simply no other way for Israel to respond, because what are we saying? That Israel should simply say to Hamas, well, go ahead, fire your missiles whenever you like. We're only ever going to make a token response. We're not going to try to degrade your capabilities. You can hold our hostage to ransom. And then if it did that for Hamas, how long before there would be imitators in the West Bank? And, you know, I've stood on the West Bank where you can see Tel Aviv Airport. You wouldn't need to lob many rockets from the West Bank at Tel Aviv Airport before you'd paralyse the whole country. So you could argue that, you know, there's a fraction of discretion in the degree of Israel's response. But I think any Israeli government, led by any leader, would have responded in essentially the same way as Netanyahu has done. But yes, politically, undoubtedly, it will help him it will reinforce his essential narrative that he has no reasonable partners to negotiate a peace with on the other side.
And another election looming. Greg Sheridan, thank you as always. Appreciate it. Foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kieran.